Good morning. Welcome to Kennedy Space Center. We're here to commemorate the decade of flying in the International Space Station. NASA's observing a decade of human life, work, and research aboard the space station, and we're kicking off the roundtable discussion here at Kennedy Space Center. We'll be followed by discussions at Johnson Space Center, Marshall Space Flight Center, and NASA headquarters. So I'll introduce our panelists. We'll have some discussions, and then we'll go to questions. So first, I'd like to introduce our Center Director, Bob Cabana. He's also a four-time shuttle veteran. Next, we have Josie Burnett, the KSC International Space Station and Spacecraft Processing Director. Sitting next to her, we have Bill Dowdell, the International Space Station and Spacecraft Processing Deputy Director for NASA. And we have David Bethay, the Director of the Boeing Company's Program Management Development. So we'll start our discussion today with, let's talk about what did it take to get ready here at KSC for that very first flight for the International Space Station.
Well, we were all in a lot different positions back then. It was a long time ago. But the thing I remember most was the initial plan for a space station was ship and shoot, get it to the Cape and launch it to space. And what really transpired was a lot different, and we did a lot of testing. And David, maybe you'd like to talk about how did we get going on that integrated testing that we ended up doing, the MEIT?
So can I step back just a little bit and say a little bit about before we got to MEIT? I really appreciate the fact that one of the things that KSC did back in that day, I was in Huntsville and we were in a factory environment, and KSC sent a group of people up to Huntsville. It included folks like Bill Parsons was one, Mark Wallish and Mark Tyrones, others, and tried to prepare us for the environment of the launch site. We had no clue what we were coming into. Having had in a factory where it was all our equipment, we could do what we wanted, we could do when we wanted it. And they tried to tell us in advance about the level of integration between the different elements that would be required. They tried to tell us about working with multiple elements here. They tried to tell us about the level of safety, the sensitivity to that at KSC. But despite all their efforts to prepare us, it was still quite a shock. You know, it was, having been kind of isolated, to come here and then see when you get to the launch site, everything steps up. It was quite an adjustment for us, and it was a lot of fun. My plan was to come here for 2 weeks and go back. I was not going to like it here. I was from Huntsville. That was home. But once I got here, I fell in love with the place, with the people, with the work, with the pace. It was an exciting time, and things were coming from everywhere.
And we partnered with you too, David. I mean, the NASA Boeing team, there was NASA Rocketdyne, NASA McDonnell Douglas, and NASA Boeing Huntsville. It was a partnership. All the groups that went to those various sites that brought the hardware to Florida, you know, it was like we were your spokesperson for the rest of the KSC rules and regulations and how we do business and that sort of thing. So that coming to meet you guys at the factory and then getting the hardware to Florida, that was part of developing the team, and that's, I think also one of the reasons why we were successful and were able to get to the test part you were talking about, Bob. So,
and I think, you know, the hardware was a challenge. And I remember seeing the node when it was an aluminum shell at Huntsville, and then watching it progress and all it went through down here. But I think more than the hardware, it was the software. I remember all the testing that we did out at the Sonny Carter facility, and you know, all that we found there. But yet, when we brought it here, we made use of the extra time with the integrated testing we did here, the MEIT testing, and we found a ton of stuff in the software that we were able to fix on the ground. I remember when we sent the commands from the aft flight deck to power up the space station for the first time. I mean, nobody was more surprised than me when it all worked. I mean, everything was perfect, but it was perfect because of all the work that we did, and as well as everybody worked, how hard they worked to make it right before it got here. It was the work that was done at KSC that made it possible to really work on orbit.
So the role that we've been talking about was a unique role for KSC back then. You know, traditionally payloads were brought to KSC and we did all the ground processing at the launch site. And what we were asked to do was go out to the factories, like to David's factory in Boeing Huntsville and other places, and to incorporate our expertise and try to prepare folks for the launch site, like he'd said. It included, besides our government, our contractors in the U.S. government, international partners as well. And so one of the key elements in those first 7 flights, was the space station, the Canadian robotic arm, the SSRMS. And it was the only international element at the time that was in the critical path for us succeeding to establishing that initial Phase A for the space station. And my role back then was to do like Bill did and others that David talked about, but go to Canada with our international partners and work with at the time it was SPAR, but it's the McDonnell Detweiler folks. The difference there was we were dealing with an international partner. We were working with another government. It wasn't just another contractor. It was another government. And it was a contractor that had done business with NASA for quite a bit of time. So, the experience at the launch site, they had plenty of experience at the launch site. Mm-hmm. But what the value that I brought to that team at the time was the MEIT. They knew that we needed to do a ground test. They knew that we knew that the ship and shoot was not the right answer, and that there would be time to do a full-up integrated test with the Canadian arm and the U.S. lab and be able to flush out some of those software problems. And we did. We found some.
We found more than software too. Wasn't there a Russian-American power converter or American-Russian power converter, or something like that was bad? And the MEI, again, it's been a while, but as I remember, I think it was our old boss Tip Talone worked with Mr. Abbey. And worked with, of course, Jay Honeycutt, who was a center director here at the time, and Denny Cross, I guess, was in the vehicle office, and to get MEIT in place. And of course, Bill Painter was the software guy, and he was part and parcel of that whole deal. Yeah. So it was a good thing we did it, and we found a lot. David, I know you found a ton of stuff in the lab, the purple Ds that came up, the computers crashed or whatever.
Yep.
So, I've been meaning to ask you, since I was the truss guy, and we had the power on the trusses, we never have gotten your power deposit. I think you still owe us. You still have it?
I'm ready to pay today after 10 years.
Okay, thank you very much.
Great service. Thank you very much.
Let the record show. I'll get 50 cents, and Mr. Sorensen gets 50
there
cents.
You go.
Okay.
There you go.
Okay. But anyway, MEIT was a very exciting time for us because we had flight crews in the building. We were trying to run as close to flight procedures as possible. We're trying to get Z1 and P6 as close to the lab as we could get because we couldn't get David to move. So it was the SSPF looked like a plumbing and electrical nightmare of sorts, But it was interesting getting everything close enough together that you get to lash together power, data, cooling, all that, and then flip the switch. So.
We made a lot of changes to the flight crew procedures when we were going through all that. It really helped. You can work stuff in a lab, you can work it on a simulator all you want, but when you're actually dealing with the real hardware, that's when you can really PV the procedures and get them right. I remember when we went over to Russia to train on the FGB, and I think the best thing about the flight home, we were on the NASA chartered flight, and Sergei Krikalev and I took all our notes from the testing that we had done over there, and we grabbed the FAO folks, the procedure writers, we got them together, and we sat down, and on that flight home, we wrote the procedures that we used on orbit. We made all the corrections to what we had, and it really, there's nothing like being with the real hardware to actually get things right. And we'd be remiss if we didn't bring it up. You mentioned George Abbey, and there was a lot that led up to those hardware testing that we did. I will never forget the George Abbey Saturday reviews, the gassers. Every Saturday from 8 to noon or longer, every senior manager briefing his system, why it was behind, and all the work that we had to do to get space station, all that. I remember the connector issues, Amphenol connectors, and all that we went through to make sure that everything was right to try and make schedule.
That was 7 a.m. in Canoga Park that I had to be in Mr. Royce Mitchell's office for the 10 o'clock or 9 o'clock, whatever Central Time, with Mr. Abbey. I remember that well. So Mr. Mitchell, the vice president, was in there, and all of his senior staff, and it was and there I was. I wasn't sure why I was there, but I was there. It was interesting.
You made a good point a few minutes ago. I'd like to expand on a little bit, and that was you talked about seeing the Node 1 at the time just being a shell up there in Huntsville. I want to make sure that as we sit here and talk about what happened here at KSC, and a lot of those, the gassers and the SDOMs and the other meetings that we had, I want to highlight the fact that the design centers were, they took this from idea to reality, and then we took it that last little bit. But the notion, the idea and the requirement that they did their work there, they handed it to us, and then they continued to support us all the way through until we got on orbit was just fantastic. And we just wouldn't have been successful if they hadn't hung in there and stayed with us. And I also remember the feeling of being overwhelmed in those gassers at what was, we just had a few things here, but the high bay was full in the SSPF, and the train of things that were coming, and we had to get things done and get it behind us, get on to the next one.
We didn't know how lucky we were.
Yeah, it was fun.
Once we got going, I mean, seeing the SSPF fill up with hardware where we couldn't even keep it all in there, and we had to use the ONC high bay to stack up, truss structure in it. Once it got going, it was truly amazing. In fact, when you consider, NASA, the United States, Japan, Canada, ESA and all its partners, Russia, all that hardware built from around the world, some of the international hardware being flown here and tested prior to going up, but all of it built all over the world, coming together on orbit for the first time and having everything work. The success that we have had on orbit, the wall of EVA, everybody said you're never going to be able to do all those EVAs. And look at, I was sitting at the FRR Friday, and in 5.5 minutes with computer graphics, they went through the EVAs that they're going to do, and it's like, well, I'm glad they're not complicated, But it's unbelievable when you consider all that we've accomplished and how well we've done it, and then you throw on top of it all the different cultures and what we've had to overcome. It is a phenomenal engineering and human achievement that the space station is today, and to think that we've been on orbit now with humans for 10 years. That's amazing.
It's one of the things that comes to mind that I learned on this program and have since learned in other ways, but it was really brought home here, is the universal language of a good engineering drawing.
Yes.
Oh, absolutely.
It doesn't matter where it came from in the world. If it's a good drawing and a good design, you can follow it, you can use it, you can read it.
Well, I'm sorry. I was just going to say, I think that's one of the key things at a working level. There's always politics, and at a high international level, negotiations get tough. I remember sitting through all the negotiations we had on the crew code of conduct and getting international agreements. I mean, everything in place. It's hard, but when you sat down with a technical issue, the engineers working with each other, language wasn't a barrier. We had a common language to get things done.
Yeah, and along those lines with the international partners and the technical solutions that we had to evolve into, the one key point is, even though we were coming at it from different points of view, everybody was after that common goal. What do we need to do to make it work? We've got a deadline, we've got our hardware, our software. What is it we need to do? And the thing I learned from a lot of those discussions, as I was an engineer at the time, was the different approaches. So our international partners, they think differently, and they not all of the engineering solutions are come to in the same manner, the same thought process. But the fact that we were going towards a common goal just made it all that much more special. And I think a lot of our success was due to the fact that we had an open mind. We could look at how these different problems needed to be solved, and we just worked together. It was an achievement from a hardware standpoint, but also a relationship and a people standpoint. Some of the best memories I have of my entire career were the early days of the station, working on that hardware, trying to, no Saturdays. My Saturdays were dedicated to work and other, people sides of things. So David and I used to, and Bill as well, we used to brief our deputy program manager, every day almost on the status of our hardware. And so David, Bill worked element 3A, 4A. So 2A went first, element 3A, 4A went second.
And
David, the lab went 5A went third, and then I was after David on the element 6A. And I was almost guaranteed to let's see, how do I say this? David always spun everybody up with the lab, and so I was almost guaranteed to have a good reception whenever it came to be my turn.
Out by the time they got done.
That's exactly true.
So that brings up a very good point, is that during those times, and I don't want to make it to sound like anyone who wasn't with us during that time, that it was all problems. The things that went smoothly just went smoothly. You know, they don't stand out in your mind. It's the times that we had something we had to pull together, find a solution together, someone who had faced the problem before come over and help us fix it. We pull on the design centers. I recall what a surprise it was and it started with 2A and it went all the way through. I guess maybe the lab, it was so complicated that we had so many issues there, was that the bigger the issue, the more challenging it was. A poorly run program dives in on people and kills the messenger. But what I found, especially back in those days, and I assume it's the same way today with the leadership, is when you encounter a problem, the vistas open up. How can we help?
That's true.
And let's go find a solution. And the walls come down and the barriers go away and the badges turn the same color and we just go find a solution.
I could, you said I can remember Jay Green in the meetings saying, when we came up with something like that, he would tell you, I will clear my calendar and we'll figure out how we need to make time, who we need to get involved to go figure out how to solve this problem. And it would be later in the afternoon, typically a noon board where we'd have that discussion. It'd be later in the afternoon we'd convene something. That was after we had some time to go get the right folks together to figure out what we were going to do. Talk to our counterparts in the vehicle office in Houston, and then we'd talk to Jay and see how the thing was going to evolve, how we were going to approach the solution. So
Jay was a hard taskmaster. But I don't think we'd have a space station on orbit today if it weren't for Jay and the work that he did helping the team get to the right solutions. And when you came to brief him, you better have you better know what you were talking about.
He had a very good nose for a poorly told story, or something like that.
It didn't have to be a good story. It just had to be a well thought out story.
And accurate.
Yeah.
Right,
Exactly.
and accurate.
Yeah. He had so much technical depth that there was no bamboozling that guy. You were dead meat if you tried that. But anyway, it was interesting.
So I hope he's watching us now.
Yeah.
Thank you, Jay.
The international aspect of it, there were signs in the bay in the early days that I think they were in Japanese and Italian and maybe German. Well, do you remember?
Yeah, that was I remember the day when it hit me that we truly were an international program. Was the little yellow signs that say the floor is wet.
Yeah,
Just a simple little communication like that. Yeah. And I walked out one day and the floor was wet. And I realized that it was in English and Japanese and Russian and German and
maybe Italian, I don't know.
Might even have been, well, I don't read Italian, don't read any of those. I just kind of recognize a little bit. But it truly hit home that the importance of communicating even the simple stuff to a lot of different people in a lot of different languages. And plus, it made for a lot of fun because, as Josie had said, in those sometimes in those noon boards, an issue would come up, and the solution would simply come from a different cultural starting point. Yeah. And so, as a person worked through to a solution, several of us might be sitting there going, "What in the world are they thinking?" But as they went through their logic and came to how they arrived at it, turned out to be a perfectly good solution. It was just a different approach.
Yeah, very true. Very true.
Well, first crew on orbit. And we'll jump to the actual first crew that manned the space station. But then I want to come back, and I got a couple stories I got to tell. But Shep's launch. He launched on October 31st, and they rendezvoused and went in the space station November 2nd. So this October 31st will be the 10-year anniversary of sending the crew up to space station. And that was Yuri Gudzenko, Sergei Krikalev, and Bill Shepard. Yuri was the commander of the Soyuz, and Bill was the commander of the space station. And we had a huge NASA contingent that went over to see the launch. And so we're flying on this Russian airplane from Moscow down to the Baikonur Cosmodrome in Kazakhstan. And the weather was really bad, and we kept delaying and delaying leaving Moscow. And so we finally get in and go. I mean, it's like, it's go now or we're not going to see the launch, right? So we're descending into our final approach there at the what was the Buran landing facility, Jubileni at Kazakhstan at Baikonur. And, the pilot's making his approach, and it's cloudy out the windows. And, we got a bunch of pilots on the airplane and everything else. And he pulls the power. He's in his flare, and I'm waiting for the wheels to touch down. And all of a sudden, the power comes back up, and I look out the window, and all I see is dirt. And we go up, and we're all talking, and, and he comes. he comes in again. And the same thing, only this time the guys on one side of the airplane see cement and the guys on the other side see dirt. and we go around again, and the next time we landed. And we got out to the launch pad, and we made it in time to see Shep launch. And, it was awesome, the excitement and everything. But the rocket lifted off, and it disappeared. We never saw it again. I mean, we saw it for just a few seconds, and that was it. And they were off to space station, but that was the beginning. And seeing those guys on orbit, being in the Mission Control Center in Moscow when they opened the hatch, and the three of them got together, I can still see them, putting their hands together and talking to our then administrator, Mr. Golden, and Yuri Koptev, the head of the Russian Space Agency, from up there starting off. And we've had a crew on orbit ever since then for 10 years. That's amazing.
Pretty amazing, definitely.
So first, one of the questions I got from the media before we launched was, who's going to be the first person in the space station? And I wouldn't tell them. And oh gosh, what a neat flight that was. I remember, first off, Nancy Curry was just phenomenal with the arm, lifting Node 1 out of the. She had to be very careful with it. we didn't want to hurt it, David. But it was like watching grass grow. The speed, I didn't know you could fly the arm that slow when she lifted it out of the payload bay, because she only had a couple inches of clearance on either side. And we got it attached to the orbiter docking station, and then we rendezvoused with Zarya. And that was pretty neat, seeing it, and flying it around and bringing it right down in the payload bay. And I couldn't see it out the windows because the node was blocking our view out the overhead and back windows. So we were flying proxops on it with a camera on the center line of the payload bay and another one on the end of the arm. And so I got the two monitors over there, and I'm keeping it centered up, about 3 feet from the end of the arm, so all Nancy has to do is reach over and grab it. In fact, in the simulator, the orbiter flies so good, every now and then, before she could reach over and grab it, I'd just fly it onto the arm. But I didn't do that on orbit. So we're fine. We're waiting to get over a Russian ground site so that they can say that the FGB's in free drift, so that when we grapple it, it doesn't fight the arm and break it. And so we're just waiting to get over and get the go for grapple. And so the orbiter maintains attitude control and pitch, roll, and yaw with the autopilot. It's too hard to fly all 6 degrees of freedom at once, so we let the autopilot hold attitude, and then we just control the translations manually. And the orbiter drifts while it's up there. Well, it had drifted to the edge of the deadband where it has to fire the jets to center things back up again and keep it in the right attitude. And when it does that, it fires the big jets, and the rolling couples into a translation. And all of a sudden, this 45,000-pound mass is coming into the payload bay and toward the arm. So I start firing the thrusters to back away from it, and nothing happens. We're not moving. It's still coming at us. Because I was in the BDAP for very fine attitude control, and you program the digital autopilot ahead of time. So real quick, I reached over and hit the ADAP so I could get some more control power, and got it backed away again and everything. And we moved back in, got it all stable again, ready to. Jim Newman, who was he wrote the rendezvous software for the PGSC that we use RPOP for manually backing up the computers and watching the rendezvous profile and stuff. All through the rendezvous, he's giving me advice. What do you think about a couple ins? How about an up? Okay, and I'm watching all the data and filtering all this. When this happened, he was just totally silent. Didn't say a word. So we got everything all sweetened up again. We're ready to grab it. And I said, Jim, you didn't offer me any advice during any of that. And he says, well, I know when to keep my mouth shut. but that really got our attention. So anyway, we finally got everything hooked up and did our EVAs, and it was time to go inside. And I will never forget that. That was really cool. We opened up the first hatch, and we got to the where the crew was going to go into the PMA-1 to get access to the big hatch to get inside the node. And I got Sergei Krikalev up alongside me, and we got the hatch open. I just waved my arm, and the two of us went in side by side. And it was an international space station, and we had an international crew, and I said, we're going to open this thing together. But that was cool. I know I'm talking a lot, but one more story. So we're docked with the space station. We've got it all opened up. We're inside. Everything's powered up. It's working good. And we had a ton of procedures that we had to do, pulling launch restraints and everything else, trying to get it ready for the crew to get up there when the service module got there. And we had way more than what we could accomplish. And, you want to get it all done, and or more if you can, to make it easier for the next crew or to make it easier for the crew when they actually get up there. And so if you were on a sleep schedule where you went to bed at 11 and got up at 7 in the morning, that was your 8 hours of sleep. I had some crew members that really needed 8 hours. And the rule was, if you wanted to be up on a flight deck and send email home or look out the window and take pictures, that was great. But when you got to the sleep period time, the mid-deck was dark. It was quiet. You had to be really quiet and not wake anybody up. And Jim Newman always stayed up late. And so he's up there, and he says, I want to go get another look at the space station tonight before we undock the next day. And so he comes down off the flight deck, through the mid-deck, back through where the airlock used to be when it was on the mid-deck, and we moved it external. And that area was filled with these, we call them refrigerator bags. You mounted 2 to the floor, 2 to the ceiling, because we carried a ton of stuff up there. And I was sleeping between 2 of them over on one side. Nancy Curry was between the other 2, and Jerry Ross and Rick Sturko were in sleeping bags plastered to the wall. And so he says, I don't want to wake Bob, and he's being real quiet as he sneaks by and goes into the airlock and turns up into the PMA. And when he gets up there, he finds me and Sergei Krikalev in the space station. And the 3 of us worked through the night. And and we talked about the future of the space station, what it was, what it meant, this international cooperative effort, what we were going to learn from it. And that was really a special night. We stayed up till like 3:30 in the morning. Finally, I said, we got to get some sleep, guys. It's going to be a really busy day tomorrow. And I made everybody leave, and we went back to bed. But that was a special evening, the 3 of us in there working on the space station, talking about the future and seeing what it's become now. It's just, it's everything that we thought it could be and more. And I truly believe space station, it's a fantastic scientific laboratory, but even more so, what a phenomenal engineering test bed for proving the systems that we need to live beyond our home planet, to really be able to go exploring. And I think that's going to be what its real worth is going to be.
Very much so.
So, Bob, you moved into a position where you got to select astronauts. Were there any particular challenges for selecting crews on the space station?
Well, first off, we couldn't have done the space station had we not done Shuttle Mir with the Russians. That really set how we work with our international partners, how we work with the Russians, that enabled us to do the space station. And those initial space station crews, space station in the astronaut office back then, when I was chief of the astronaut office, we were flying 7, 8 shuttle flights a year, 9. Shuttle was really booming, and there was a lot going on. And, folks looked at a year of training to go fly a shuttle mission, or, I got to learn Russian. I got to spend 2 to 3 years training for a space station flight, all this travel back and forth. It was hard. It was really hard. And then the shuttle was designed, you had, from the 5th to the 95th percentile male and female can fit in the shuttle. It's a phenomenal vehicle as far as, crew size. Whereas if you go to space station, and back then it was prior to the TMA, Soyuz TMA, the restrictions on the crew, the Soyuz was the lifeboat that got the crew home. So even if you were flying up and down on shuttle, you had to fit in a Soyuz. And that eliminated a significant number of the astronaut corps for being able to assign them to a flight. And then the standards for a long-duration flight from a health medical point of view are a little more stringent than they are for a shuttle mission, so you had to meet all those requirements. So even though I had 100 and some astronauts, the number that were actually available to go fly on the space station from a physical point of view was a lot smaller. And then you wanted them to have the right experience and everything too, and then to sign up that commitment to learn all that they had to learn. I learned enough Russian to be socially active over there, but to learn all the technical Russian to actually fly on a Soyuz and work the Russian systems, that was asking an awful lot of somebody. So those first crews, it was really difficult finding the right folks and getting the commitment from them to do it. And I never expected it would be as long as it was from when they got assigned to when we actually flew. We had some slips there. with the service module, getting it on orbit to get the crews up there. But it all worked out. And I remember Susan Helms and Jim Voss flew together with Yuri Usashov on the second increment. And Susan really didn't want to do it, I don't think. But she said yes, and she threw herself into it. And I was, when she got back from her mission, she said, "Bob, I'm so happy that you assigned me to that flight. That was such a wonderful experience. It was so great to be on the space station and do what we did." And I think if you talk to any space station crew, I'd give anything to go have a long duration flight. That's what it's really like to be in space. The shuttle's phenomenal, you know, but living in space for an extended period of time, that's what it's all about. So yeah, those first space station crews, it was hard, and it's still hard. It asks an awful lot of folks, but we've gotten a lot better at how we train. We've shortened the training time. I think things are working a lot better from that point of view. But initially, there was a lot of learning that had to go on to get to the point where, you know, we could get folks up there and work together with the Russians to make it happen.
You talked about station as a wonderful engineering test bed. It was also a wonderful test bed for learning procedures and processes, and I'll share one small one since we're into the storytelling part that was particularly important to me and was going to be important to you if we hadn't fixed the issue. And it was on Bill was one of the ones who was telling us, find it on the ground and fix it on the ground. I think he was the one who was trying to beat that into us, those of us who had been.
Wasn't actually beating. I wasn't.
Well, no,
actually beating.
I don't know. I used to know you back then. You've mellowed a lot.
He was working us pretty good. He was right. And as an example, for those of us who'd come out of that factory environment, just the attention to detail that was required was a level above. Well, two things: the notion of no traveled work. Nothing. You can't have traveled work when you leave the Cape. Traveled risk. You want as little traveled risk as you can possibly live with when you leave the Cape, and that's a different mentality for folks who have started out in the factory. Well, I remember we would on Node 1. When we got everything done, she was finished. She was just complete. And the notion came up of, well, we've got an extra day, so let's just do a whistle test. And for those, what we were called a whistle test was you just put a little pressure on it, just to make sure that everything seals up. And we were supremely confident that the whistle test was going to pass. We had one day, we might as well do it. Okay, we'll go do this. So we hooked up a tank, we put a little pressure on, put a little air into it, no pressure. Well, our pucker factor went up. We put a little more air into it, no pressure. Well, at that point, it's really one of those, everybody help. We're sounding the fire alarm. Josie's coming running, Bill, everybody's coming to try to figure out what was going on. And we kept trying and kept working with it, could not figure out why it was not holding pressure, and that means it's not holding air, and for there not to be air in it when Bob goes to open up the hatch on orbit would have been disastrous. I mean, it would have been the end of the program. As it turns out, we took what's called a sniffer and went around, and at every single place where all over we were trying to find, as we were putting helium in, trying to find where it was coming out, and we were going along, and then at one place we got a big spike. As it turns out, it was on one of the hatches. We opened up the cover for the hatches, and there was something called a manual pressure equalization valve. And it's very simple. It's on either side of a hatch, and it has a little thing. You just go like that. You turn it one way, and it's open. You turn it the other way, and it's closed. Well, everything that we'd studied and understood, and our logic, which was flawed, told us you turn it one direction, and on the other side it's going to go, right? It was one of those things that made you think it went like that. No, it went like this. You could do one side or the other, and when you closed one, it didn't necessarily close the other. So this was just a small little detail of the most minor nature. And had we not found that, had we not done that one little extra thing on that one little extra day, just to make sure that we hadn't made some kind of a mistake, it would have been a very bad outcome. And I just can't tell you the number of little things like that. I mean, we proved to be pretty good at dealing with the big risks that we understood and studied, and we had lots of people work on them. The MEIT was an example of a big test that came up with all kinds of little things that, not because of incompetence, were unforeseeable, because of the total complexity. And when you get a whole bunch of things working together, they might not all work. They have a personality. The hardware has its own personality, and you have to accommodate that. So that was the day that I got it. You know, my knees went weak thinking about what would have happened had we gotten on orbit and there not been air in the node. It was something that simple that we were sure we understood, and you could look at it and see that when the hatch was up, you couldn't see the inside, and when the hatch was down and covered, you couldn't see the outside. So even through all of our configuration, it was one little thing that slipped through, and it could have been that one little disastrous thing. And you guys who were native KSC folks, who had been shuttle launch NTDs or done other things that had the heritage to come to us and explain to us how a small thing can lead to a very bad result, was instrumental in everybody getting behind taking the extra time to do the extra test.
I think that attitude is prevalent through the program in all the centers and all of our industry partners and so on. I don't know if you guys out here followed the pump module work that the guys in Houston, Boeing and NASA guys took care of when we had the pump module fail on orbit and how we recovered from that. That same kind of thinking, that same kind of how do we go fix this problem. I mean, we're calling out the, hey, is there anything you need us to do or whatever, and those guys are all busted at trying to figure out how to take care of it. That same kind of spirit has been prevalent since day one of this program, and that's just a more recent example of that very same thing. So
it's a team effort.
Yes,
and I
it
think
is.
that's what Space Station has shown more than anything else, is how we work together as a team. Not just the international partners, but how all the NASA centers work together. You know, I was very fortunate because of my position that I got to travel around and see the hardware at all the different centers and work with the different centers. But it didn't matter whether I was going to Marshall, working out at Sonny Carter, coming here to the Cape. It was one team pulling together to make it work, and that we're still that way. I think that's really important.
I would say another thing that very much to the credit of NASA is, and I'll pick on MEIT as an example, or when we did some of the tests with the arm, Josie was instrumental too. When we would uncover something that was out of family, it would be very easy to start looking for who to blame. And that was never the case. We would sit down and we'd say, okay, is the problem on your side or on my side? Maybe it's on both. Maybe it's on neither and there's something else that's coming in. And sitting down, not creating a team environment and not creating an adversarial environment was allowed us to work through problems that were very complicated and do it pretty quickly, or at least we felt like we were trying to get them solved quickly.
I think all of us were so passionate about what we were doing. It never occurred to anybody, whenever a problem did occur, to point fingers. It was all about what do we need to do to get it done. Who could help us answer this question? And you learn to think broadly. It wasn't just who in this general team can we go look to. It's who across the nation, who across the world can help us solve these problems. And it was really an incredible experience. If we're talking about stories. I had one
Go for it.
that is not as exciting as Bob's story. So I was a little different than the rest of our station team in those early days, simply because of I'm working with the international partners. I would go and support the integrated tests in Canada when those big element tests would occur, and they always occurred in the middle of the winter in Toronto, right? So Florida girl, native Floridian. I go in January, February, March. It always took 3 months to do these tests, and it was wonderful. I mean, it was a lot of work. We did the 12-hour days. Great teamwork there. We'd bring in some of our other NASA and contractors would come in as well from the U.S. to support these tests. But you spend 12-hour days. You get to know the folks. They sometimes invite you home to their families, and you have dinner with them. I learned to curl. I learned how to play snooker. And I learned to appreciate French fries with cheese curd and mayonnaise. Just these unique things.
Pass the ketchup, Josie.
But usually, yeah, right. Towards the end of those tests, you start to burn out a little bit. And I do remember being in in the hotel room. So there's a lot of hotel time as well. And so I'm in the hotel room. I'm watching TV, and it would have been in February, I suppose, and it was the State of the Union, right? And so it was the President of the United States talking to our nation about the State of the Union, and they pan into the audience, and sitting next to the First Lady was Bob Cabana in his blue suit. And so maybe that was the moment for me, David, when I realized, wow, what I'm doing something that's larger than anything I've ever done before. This is really important. Building this station is it's a grand thing. It's comparable to building the pyramids. And I think at that moment in the hotel room, I really, really appreciated the little role that I was given in building this enormous accomplishment. And just to see Bob in the blue suit sitting next to the First Lady was just made my whole month.
I'm glad I made your day, Josie. It was kind of fun wearing my flight jacket and sitting there. The people that sit next to the First Lady are supposed to be folks that have, there's key messages within the State of the Union address, and it was actually written in there to talk about that was the year we flew the first space station assembly mission and stuff. Right. And the speech got rewritten a little bit. It still talked about NASA in the future and stuff, but the primary emphasis then was John Glenn flying. He flew the flight before, if you remember, the node going into space, and got a lot of attention, rightfully so. Good man. Talking about the space station and what made it successful, Randy Brinkley was the program manager when we launched the FGB and Node 1, and he really pushed to get them up there. We had some delays before we got the service module up there and could actually get a crew on board. But Tommy Holloway, following Randy, did a truly outstanding job pulling together what was a program that had a lot of budget problems, getting a surplus built back up, keeping things on track, bringing technical solutions and ops experience to bear from his shuttle experience and MOD experience to make it successful. I remember after I flew my mission, I was with George Abbey was the center director at JSC at the time, and the commander gets some time with the director to talk about the mission and stuff, and it was a phenomenal flight from start to finish. It was perfect, and I was telling George, and he was telling me what a great job we did and everything, and I said, George, I don't know how I can top that flight. And he said, well, I don't know why you'd want to try. and I said, that's it. I'm going to be wearing a tie from now on. And he asked me to go down and work in the space station program about a year after that. And I went to work for Tommy. And Tommy was just an outstanding program manager. I learned an awful lot from him as his manager for international operations, and we were still doing a lot of negotiations even back then on with our international partners, getting to where we needed to be. And Tommy had it right, though. You know how space shuttle launches go? There's always a delay for weather or something or some technical problem. Tommy would go to all the FRRs because he knew that was a finite period of time that he'd be down here and all the real technical stuff would get discussed. Mm-hmm. And then he'd send me to the launches so that he could stay and do work back in Houston, and I'd be the one down here to handle all the media questions of what was going on and suffer the delays, down here. But he did a great job. And then you got to give Bill Gerstenmaier credit for all that he did as space station program manager, continuing to be frugal. I remember when I was over in Russia, Bill was the space station program manager. And he was trying to. I ended up basically cutting my budget in half over in Russia and giving the money to him so that he could keep hardware moving and stuff. And of course, well, now that I mentioned Bill, you got to mention Seth. And, we've had a great team leading the space station. Absolutely.
And, you look at. I used to get to talk to Bob in the morning when he was the deputy program manager, and Mr. Gerstenmaier came along. And Mike was in the vehicle office at the time, and I did a lot of conversations with him. So I count myself lucky getting to call you guys up and talk about what was going on in Florida. That was a fun part of the job, being able to interface with you guys. And also, you guys are all hardware junkies, so that made it even easier. That That was a neat thing. So
I miss that. I think it's great being at the level we're at now, but I still miss getting into the technical discussions. And I don't have my BlackBerry on me, so it doesn't buzz, but I still get notes from the MER on what's going on with Space Station, even though I'm over here, just so I can keep track.
That's one of the things that I always found intriguing is at all level. I mean, the leaders that you were talking about there, and all the broad skills that are necessary. But no matter what problem we encountered, you could never tell who was going to walk through the door with a solution, or where they were going to come from, or what their background was going to be. Some of the most surprising people had a depth of knowledge of how to go practically solve some really complicated problem that was just fantastic. And they were all always willing to do it, always enthusiastic about jumping in. And that really, we didn't have the skills here to solve a lot of the problems. It required that somebody from outside come in and help us. And the enthusiasm with which they did that, both in the contractor world and in NASA, was just fantastic.
So all that hard technical work that we did over the years, there had to be a little socializing too that went on, and I think we had some great team building exercises. Now, over in Russia, team building can take on a whole new context, and we had our crews that were over there. The Russians actually built 3 cottages, duplexes, for the crews and their families to stay in while they were training over in Russia. And Shep being the first crew, there were 2 things that in its cottage number 3 he had to have. First off, you had to have a gym. Shep was a weightlifter, so in the basement of cottage 3, there's a gym with a lot of free weights and other stuff. And then Shep built Shep's bar in the other side, and it's an amazing place. It's a real social gathering place over there. When at the end of the day, when training's done, and it's got, I can't tell you the number of people that have signed this thing. Tom Hanks has signed it, when he was over there, and it's a unique environment to get together over there after a launch or landing and have social time with everybody.
Well, I think we have time for a few questions. I think some folks in the audience, if you'd raise your hands and then wait for the mic and identify yourself. We'll start with Dan Billow.
Dan Billow from WESH-TV. I appreciate the discussion. For Bob and anyone else who wants to jump in, we kind of don't appreciate things till they're gone sometimes. Could you discuss a little bit how the space station is kind of a monument to the capabilities of the space shuttle?
We could not have done the space station without the space shuttle. It wouldn't be there today. When you look at what the space shuttle can do, the mass it can carry to orbit, the crew capability, the EVA capability, the robotic capabilities, the flexibility that the shuttle provides for getting stuff up and down, it wouldn't have happened without the space shuttle. Absolutely.
And certainly from the expertise of people who are involved here at I'm sure all over the country, but my experience here at KSC, who had shuttle program experience and then brought that directly from the north end of KSC down to the industrial area to help us make sure that we learned from the lessons of the shuttle program, was just invaluable in our success.
I think you had another question in the front row. Ken, did you have one?
Hi, Ken Kramer for Spaceflight Magazine. Well, I'm very impressed by your very complexity of the ISS. You talked about all these insidious little difficulties. I think the public doesn't have any really idea about this. Was there anything that you missed in all of these problems, a problem that you found on orbit? And I'm also wondering, Hubble, did you learn any lessons from Hubble, the difficulties initially with Hubble that you were able to apply, maybe even in a management perspective, to how you dealt with problems on the ISS?
Well, I think ISS was designed for crew interaction, not just in the internal environment, but from an EVA point of view, to be able to change modules. I mean, you can talk more about that, Bill.
Well, what struck me in your question, from a how we built and tested early elements point of view, we took the approach when we went to work with the Boeing guys, or the Rocketdyne guys as it was at the time on Canoga Park. We took the approach, we're going to write requirements to go certify this vehicle for flight. We're going to write down everything, and I mean everything, that we think we need to do to certify this hardware. We're not going to look at it, is it possible to do this test, or is it possible to do this work on the ground? We're going to write it down, and then we're going to figure out afterward if we can or can't and what that means to us from a risk point of view, and then tell the bosses how we're doing. And so with that kind of approach, I think we precluded not finding things that would have been a showstopper, or that the problems that you encountered on orbit were of a nature that were fixable. And we can upload software. We can, if a piece isn't working, we can take something up the next time. But there's never been something really that was so big or so problematic that we couldn't make do with what we had on orbit and get on with the next mission. And again, I think that comes back to the whole gang looking at how you're going to go do this work on the ground to certify for flight and make sure that it fit the bill. And I would tell you we were successful. We did a good job of that.
But we did find stuff. I mean, every mission, I think there's been some little thing that's popped up. On my flight, one of those hatches on the space station are very complex, the large ones. And we had a hatch. It wouldn't open all the way. And as a result of that, we studied it, came back, and we had to readjust how we do the hatches.
Yeah, we've done some mods to the hatches. We've done the MPLMs are going up. They got those mods. The Node 2 got the mod. Node 3 got the mod. So, we've learned and kept right on doing. So,
it's like the covers on the cupola. One of them not being able to be installed right away because of the little different, So, I mean, there's been stuff like that. But if we haven't been able to fix it, most of the times we get it fixed while the shuttle is up there during that mission. Sometimes we've got to study a little bit more and send up something else on the next flight. But, overall, there hasn't been any showstoppers. There's been nothing critical that has not been caught on the ground.
And you again, going back to the pump module thing that we dealt with not too long ago on orbit, you look at that. I mean, that is a testament to what we're capable of doing. And you just, again, being a bystander for that, but I'm just still amazed at that work as well. So the combination of that flight ops team in Houston, the ground ops team around the rest of the agency, I think we did a heck of a job fleshing all that stuff out so we didn't have a showstopper.
And that was done without the shuttle being up there. That was all ISS crew, pre-planned with hardware spares stowed on orbit, ready to get the job done.
Pretty amazing.
Yeah, so even today, you can reach across the entire agency for problem solving. So when that problem occurred, some of the folks that worked on the ground from years past, they still had contacts back with the MER, and so again, even those on-orbit problems are team efforts to resolve.
The phones we all turned off when we walked in here to talk to you guys, they're turned on the other 24 hours a day in case something comes up that the guys in Houston or wherever around the country, if they want our help, they know how to get a hold of us. And we're glad to provide it.
Steve Gelbach, Fox Orlando. Bob, you'd said the real worth was in learning how to live on in orbit. Is the mission now going to change a little bit after the shuttle retires in the next 10 years of doing more science? What's going to change now with shuttle retirement in the last 10 years of the space station?
Absolutely, we're going to do more science. I mean, it is a phenomenal science lab, a national asset. And, we've finally gotten to the point where we've completed it. We got a crew of 6 on board. They're already doing outstanding science up there and learning a lot. So, yes, it's going to be a phenomenal science test bed. Me being an engineer and not a scientist, I look at what can we learn. We're going exploring. We're going to leave our home planet. We're going to, have commercial operations to low Earth orbit, but we're going to build something that allows us to leave Earth. Well, what do we need for that? We've got a lot of systems that we have to prove. If you look at the oxygen generation system on the space station, the carbon dioxide removal system, we are constantly tweaking and repairing them up there. We have to have totally reliable systems when we leave our home planet for an extended period of time. And we're not going to be able to carry all the spare parts along with us or have all the, the resupply as we're going to a new destination. It's got to work when we go. And we're learning that on Space Station. We're figuring that out. I think that's really important to me.
Hi, folks. Greg Pallone, News 13. Appreciate the briefing today. Tomorrow, whether you know it or not, is the one-year anniversary of the Ares 1X rocket, test rocket. Curious to know from each of you or whoever would like to jump in, the thoughts of what has become the International Space Station, what still will become the International Space Station over the next several years, and also the unwritten chapters that are to be the next step, which we do not know now that Constellation has kind of been put on hold. Your thoughts?
Yeah. I think it's very clear through the Authorization Act that's been put into law. It's telling us that we are going to go with commercial access to the space station. We're going to make that work. The CC Dev effort that's going on, Planning Office is leading that here at KSC. Working very closely with our folks at Johnson Space Center. That is where we're going. We have been directed to build a heavy lift rocket to come up with this architecture that allows us to go anywhere, to asteroids, to the moon, Mars, you name it. We have a future, and I think it's very clear we're going to make that happen.
Any other questions? I think we.
I know I read ESA was talking about using the space station in the future in the next 10 years as a kind of a platform to launch from for even further Earth or further space exploration, longer term, the moon, Mars. Is there any discussion about that, using it just beyond the orbit, but as a platform for further human exploration?
I haven't had those discussions.
I haven't directly, but it's not a leap of faith to envision the International Space Station as a platform to do future exploration. It's in a position on orbit where international partners can reach, and so it's kind of a logical orbit to be able to involve international partners. But a lot of that, again, I haven't been involved in any direct conversations. But the capability is there, and it's an orbiting laboratory, but it's also a platform for future exploration.
Yeah, I think that's another key thing that the space station has given us. When you look at the international model and how we work together and what we've accomplished up there, it really has set the standard for when we leave our home planet, how we press forward with international cooperation and make it work. Because exploration in space, it's very expensive. It's difficult. It's hard. It's challenging. I was talking out at the pad today, looking at the vehicle. I went out there this morning and did a FOD walk down with the crew at sunrise. And you look at that orbiter and what it takes to process it and get it ready. And the general public doesn't appreciate that. They see a rocket take off and they think, wow, that's really neat. They see the space station on orbit and the crews flying through it and all that stuff. And they don't realize the effort that we go through on the ground to make it successful. To keep humans alive and safe up there in that harsh environment of space. It's a vacuum. It's really cold in the shade and it's really hot in the sun, and there's no air to breathe. And it's easy to put a satellite up there, but to put a human up there and keep them alive and safe and bring them home safely, it's a lot of hard work. And the international effort that we have going on, how we're working together, I think it's going to be a great model for how we proceed when we leave our home planet.
And on that note, that's all the time we have here at Kennedy for our portion of the anniversary of the space station. So we'd like to wrap this up. Thank you for coming. The next briefing starts at 1 o'clock Eastern from the Johnson Space Center. Thank you.